Hey everybody, welcome back. I am having some kind of hair day, hopefully a good one, and I'm going to be talking you through your FAQs. I'm going to be answering your questions about this painting. You all had a lot of questions about painting more like John Singer Sargent, about painting wet into wet without making a mess, about painting loose portraits without losing the likeness, and here I'm excited to walk through the answers to these questions today. And I'm going to be doing it as if these were questions directly from my students. So I'm going to be answering them as if you and I were working together in a mentorship format. This will give you a great taste of how I like to work, and also how I like to answer my own questions or work through my own challenges when painting. That being said, if you have more questions about mastering loose expressive portraiture or painting more like John Singer Sargent or incredible painters like Richard Schmid, I'm hosting a live masterclass on Monday. That's August 5th, and it's going to be at 3 p.m. Eastern. I'm going to be answering more of your FAQs live, and there's going to be a live Q&A with me. So if you would like to get more answers to questions like these and have a chance to chat with me directly about your painting questions, make sure you sign up via the link in the description. Okay, let's dive into these questions. So first up, Charlotte asks, I'm interested to find out how to apply the last highlight strokes of paint without making them look chalky or gloopy. I love the way John Singer Sargent applies paint, but I just can't seem to do it. His strokes seem so delicate and always appropriately placed. So Charlotte, this is one instance where actually seeing exactly what this would look like for you and what it looks like when a painting doesn't quite go the way you want is worth 1,000 words. In my experience, painters tend to really overwork the highlights into the area that they're trying to place it. And the reality is that the overall area does seem to just get too blown out. It gets too light too quickly. It's also easy for that general area to start to get unmanageably thick. I think on this particular portrait, some of the challenging areas might be like along the forearm, for instance, of the arm that is in the light. I could also see you having these kinds of questions about some of the lighter areas of the fabric. So what I did to really manage this in this painting was, first and foremost, I wanted to be really intentional about the thickness of my paint throughout the entire session. What this means is that I wanted to make sure I wasn't starting with my paint too thick. This can absolutely make painting wet into wet really challenging, and I think it's one thing that separates a really skilled alla prima painter or a painter who is used to working wet into wet from painters who maybe aren't quite as confident with this technique. They're masters at being able to manage the paint layer and to know exactly how thick or thin they need to be to get the effect that they want. This does come primarily through repetition and practice and just being able to feel this out. So if this isn't happening for you yet, this does come intuitively with time. Oftentimes we are really, really tempted, or we believe that if we just are kind of given the right answer, that everything will click into place. But a lot of painting mastery is more about developing that intuitive sense of what works and what doesn't. And unfortunately, that's not the kind of thing we can wave a magic wand and just give to you. But fortunately, it is the kind of thing where if you are just patient and you show up over and over and you are being thoughtful when it comes to your own painting practice, you will start to find that you get that intuitive feel for how you like the paint to be, and how thick or thin it needs to be for you to be able to apply those highlights without it starting to look gloopy or without overworking it and having it become chalky. So I think two things that I would recommend right off the bat. One would be when you are working in an area where you know you're going to place a highlight. First and foremost, getting the overall area dialed in as far as the color and the value can be really helpful. If you are starting from a place of the value not being quite right and you feel like you have to overcorrect when it comes to putting in your highlight so that the highlight doesn't look too dark, it's really tempting to just use more paint than you need, and then it will start to look gloopy. Similarly, if you're using a really heavy hand to make that correction, that's usually when that really light paint tends to mix in with the paint underneath and you get a really chalky look. Now, one thing I do really suggest that you think about, and I think this is something that all of us can consider, is really look at the color of the highlight that you're painting. In a piece like this one, especially if I'm talking about the highlights in the skirt, yes, that is mostly going to be titanium white. Similarly, in a very fair-skinned person, the highlights in their flesh tone is probably going to involve a good bit of titanium white. That being said, that is not universally true, and oftentimes our highlights can come out looking really chalky when we just reach straight for the titanium white. So definitely really study your reference. Use something like the color checker if you're working from life, or use like the eyedropper tool if you're using a photo reference, and actually see what color is that highlight. Oftentimes we really sap all of the color from it and we reach directly for that white paint, and it really takes us right to this place of it looking really chalky. So that's an immediate strategy that you can put into place that can help you to avoid a lot of those chalky pitfalls. All right, next up, Cindy asks, given your program is the Alla Prima Bootcamp, is a painting like this one done in one session? So Cindy, this is a great question and a very reasonable one to ask. So I really prefer working wet and wet. I enjoy what happens when you have a wet paint layer that you can work into. There is a learning curve with it, and we'll talk about that in just a second, but it unlocks some really fantastic effects when you are confident working this way, and you can trust that either you're not going to make mud in the first place, or you know how to, save something and bring it back from the brink if you do accidentally muddy up an area, which does happen. It happens to me in every painting. At this point, though, I'm just really seasoned with actually making those corrections. For this painting, I would love to say that yes, I did this whole thing in one sitting, but the truth is that this painting is a little bit big for me to finish in one sitting, no matter how ambitious I'm feeling. This was done over about 3 days, and I had blocked off a good chunk of time every day to work on them. Now, a lot of the painting stayed reasonably wet because those 3 days were all back to back. But that's certainly not the same as Alla Prima. I would say it's direct painting. I would say it's largely wet into wet painting, but technically Alla Prima means one sitting, which this was not. But that's okay. I wouldn't suddenly categorize this painting differently just because I did have to take breaks. After all, so many of Sargent's great portraits were done across multiple days, but he did go out of his way to take advantage of painting wet into wet. And I know that he would often really try to make sure that one section of the painting was finished in one sitting, and then the next sitting would be dedicated to another area of the painting. Now, that might not be universally true. I know that there are areas of his paintings where clearly he's using dry brush techniques and he has allowed the painting to dry. That being said, a really key element to being able to work Alla Prima is to be able to work wet paint into wet without muddying it up. So in this painting, I'm going to kind of ignore the parts of the piece where maybe it did start to set up and dry, because those areas just aren't as tricky. A good chunk of this painting was made easier to avoid the muddiness in because I was really deliberate with where I put my paint in the first place, and I was intentional in terms of not letting my paint layer get too thick too fast. So I'll share with you what I mean. So for instance, let's take a look at this boundary between the arm of the chair and then the beginning of her dress. This is an area where we're going almost from black to almost white. There's a lot of contrast here. It's also a very hard edge, and it would be very easy for this to become muddy or chalky and gray. This isn't also unique to just value issues where you have an extreme contrast between light and dark. This also applies when you're talking about a vivid red versus a very high chroma green. Very easy for these things to start mixing together to become brown if that isn't what you want, unfortunately. So one thing that I was really careful to do in this piece was I really wanted to protect the areas that I knew were going to involve a lot of white paint. And that meant not accidentally painting into those areas with that dark brown. And the opposite is very true. I needed to be really careful not to let titanium white get into these rich darks, because that can really contaminate that area, especially because the dark areas in this painting are largely transparent colors. So this is largely transparent oxide brown mixed with ultramarine blue, two pretty translucent pigments, as you can see in some of these marks around the periphery of the painting. As soon as a speck of an opaque pigment like titanium white gets in there, it loses all of that beautiful jewel-like translucency and it starts to look really chalky real quick. And so just keeping these areas really clean and really separate made a very significant difference in terms of setting me up for success here. From there, once I have the areas of really high contrast essentially separated out, and I'm really careful not to have like cross-contamination between those areas, I wanted to make sure that the colors I laid down were as close as they could be to the final color that I needed to mix. I'll give you an example. Let's take this arm that's in the foreground, for instance. In this arm, I did lay down a base flesh tone. I did at the beginning indicate some of the shadow areas in the arm, but from that, I knew that it wasn't going to be a huge change of value or color to put the highlights in to that forearm. Because I was already in the ballpark color and value-wise, it would be okay if I actually laid down a stroke of paint that blended into the underlying area of paint on the arm. In fact, that could probably enhance the sense of roundness if they blend together a little bit. Because I was already pretty accurate with my color and my value, this actually unlocked that capability for added softness. Now, what if I'm talking about an area where I need to place a highlight in a part of the painting that's really dark? This isn't a painting where a lot of that is happening, but let's use something like the far side of the hair as an example of this. So I have some pretty dark browns in here, and then I need to go to, I would say like a very like soft, mousy, light brown that has some gray in it for this highlight color. There's a couple of different ways I can do this. If that highlight is big enough, again, I can simply reserve it. I can leave it as an unpainted area and paint the darks around it. Or if I've already laid down a lot of darks and I want to lay that highlight on top of it, what I can do is I can actually take my brush, ideally a softer brush. Counterintuitively, it makes this easier because it's harder to misuse your really soft brush for this kind of application. But what I can do is I can load up the highlight color onto my brush. I need to make sure I have a very generous amount of paint on here. And then I can lay the brush down sideways to make my mark and just let the weight of the brush with the paint on it create that deposit rather than pushing down with my brush tip. So again, just to kind of show you the difference, I think what people are often really tempted to do in painting a highlight, they will have too little paint on the brush, they'll put the brush tip down and they will press in, and that really muddies up the color. Instead, what I would think about is putting a really generous amount of paint on the brush. Again, just like I was saying for Charlotte, make sure that you've mixed up the exact highlight color that you need, and then just lay it on really softly on its side and just lift the brush off at the end, and it should deposit a really subtle highlight color without it being overly gloopy, but without it getting overly muddy and blended. Patrice asks, I'm interested to know whether you planned out the color scheme ahead of time in posing the model or whether you adjusted the color to create a complementary scheme. It's a really beautiful painting. Thank you so much, Patrice. That really means a lot. So I did not go in with a really clear idea of what the color scheme for the final painting would be. Here are the things that I did go into the photo shoot with, though. I had a really solid sense overall of what I wanted for the dress color. I wanted something light, something that could reflect a lot of color. but I was really just like open to exactly what that might look like in practice. I thought that we would probably be taking our photo shoot outdoors, but it just so happened that their home had these really beautiful furnishings in them, and we opted for this incredible chair that just had absolutely stunning details, and I thought that the colors worked really well together. But I only really knew that once I was there in the location. So we mixed things up. We moved to different chairs, we changed the lighting around, I changed my angle around quite a bit. I was prepared to go outside. If I recall correctly, the only reason we didn't was because I think it was threatening to storm that day. If I hadn't gotten a really great shot, I probably would have gone back and actually tried to get some outdoor reference on a different day with better weather. But because when I went back to the studio, I took a look at this reference and thought, this is exactly what I want, I didn't need to go back for that second take. So I have a video on my channel already of me going and editing these photographs and actually going through and choosing the various elements. So I did do some things in Photoshop to select what to me felt like the strongest photograph from this photo shoot. I made some tweaks to posing of the hand and the arm. I played a little bit with the exact angle of her face. And then I also played a little bit with just the exposure on the rest of the scene, just to really create that sense of glow coming from her dress. This is something where if you were my student and we were chatting on a Zoom call about a question you had about this painting, or we were talking about a plan for one of your own compositions, I would probably tell you that it's more important to be open to what can happen versus trying to force one specific thing to happen. Because if I had gone into this painting thinking that I could really force a specific outcome, I wouldn't have gotten this reference. In fact, I've talked about this before, but this reference happened specifically because I told my model here that she could take a break, and she was just enjoying playing with this new dress that she got for this photo shoot and didn't think that I was paying attention to her. That being said, I did do my best to come prepared to this photo shoot. So I had worked with her mom to really thoughtfully pick out the specific dress that she was going to wear. I looked at a lot of paintings as well before I went in to do this photo shoot. That meant that already going in, I had some ideas of different ways that we could play around with the furniture, with the composition. I had specific ideas for angles, for poses, for props that she could work with. That made a really big difference. It's why I'm such a big believer in using something like a vision board or an inspiration board to help guide your painting journey. And not only does it give you this ability to visualize where you're wanting to take your work, but for specific projects like this one, it can really break down exactly what kinds of compositions would work and what compositions wouldn't, including answering questions like these color schemes. So I do talk about this in depth in the planning video for this piece. I will make sure to link that above so you can actually dive right into the nitty-gritty. That being said, one other note that I want to make, because obviously there is a real departure from this reference photo to what I painted here. And that is a place where that specific inspiration board made a huge difference. I really love these vignetted style paintings. I like a painting where you have a really high degree of clarity and realism in the subject's face. And as you move away from the face, you get into more and more abstraction until by the time you're in the background, it just looks like a celebration of brushwork versus a painstaking portrayal of every little detail. My inspiration board really showed me that that's what I prioritize. And when I was comparing this reference to that inspiration board, what I found was that there just really was an opportunity here to actually just lose so much of this background information. So this was a planning step that I took, and I did actually really make sure that this kind of abstracted background with this brown color scheme versus the slightly greenish color scheme I did test that out to make sure it would work beforehand. Okay, moving on, I have questions from Sandra and Joseph about what brands of paint and medium and just materials that I use overall. So for this, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to show you what I had just to the right of this painting in progress. So while filming this, of course, I did have my palette up so you can see actually exactly what I was mixing. So for all of you who are really eager to see what my paint mixtures look like and what my palette looks like when I'm in action, I wanted to make sure that I really captured this for you in this video series. So I was actually playing around with a new set of paints for this particular painting. All of the paint colors here are by Vasari, starting with Vasari Titanium White, going into Yellow Ochre, Terra Rosa, Transparent Oxide Red, Transparent Oxide Brown, Permanent Rose, which has a different name in the Vasari line. I want to say that's Ruby Red, then Viridian, and Ultramarine. And then my medium is Rublev's Oleogel. And for some of the kind of translucent, thin washes that you see in the early stages of this painting, those washes were achieved using Gamsol. So I used Gamsol as my solvent. That was thinning the paint in the early stages of this piece. And then, especially as I built up more opacity, I switched away from Gamsol and I instead switched to using Oleogel. One thing, though, that I did notice using the Vasari paint, which I really enjoyed, was that it really minimized the need for me to add any medium. I know this is a really common question. A lot of my students prefer not to have to use medium if they don't have to. It's why a lot of artists really like Mark Carter's paints, because you do not have to take that added step of including medium. And I found that for me, the Vasari had that, that kind of sweet spot of consistency where you don't necessarily need to include medium if you don't want. That was especially true in colors like the Titanium White, which are notoriously really stiff and not very creamy in other brands. So I really enjoyed this brand and these pigments for this particular piece, but they were a little bit new for me. I hadn't actually worked with these particular colors before this specific piece. The only other thing for me to mention is that the surface that I'm painting on here is a Raymar panel. I believe this was a Raymar double oil primed. I want to say this is a fine weave, like a portrait linen. That being said, it might, just because of the size, be the medium weave. So most of the paintings that you see me create here on YouTube are done using Raymar panels. For smaller pieces, for portrait pieces, I find that the fine portrait weave winds up being more ideal. But for pieces that maybe are a little bit bigger, pieces where it makes sense to have more impasto, like a landscape maybe, or just pieces where I really want to pile on the paint, that coarser medium weave is ideal for that application. But as you get bigger, sometimes really fine weave just feels like it can't quite hold the paint the way I want it to. So sometimes as I go bigger, I will actually switch to that medium weave. But I think on this one, this is a fine weave. All right, next up, Susan asks, my question would be how to achieve that beautiful transparency of her skirt. So this one is really interesting, and this is why I wanted to actually pull up the photograph of this painting so you all can get just like a closer look at what this really looks like in action. Now that I have this really zoomed in, my hope is that you can see that I have some areas of the skirt that are done with various strokes of dry brush, which you can actually see in the form of this kind of bumpy texture. This texture is always my sign that the paint wasn't super wet. The paint that's being applied could be wet, but the underlayer of the painting probably isn't when getting this kind of mark. So some of the transparency comes from literally just doing multiple strokes of that dry brush technique and letting the different, almost like pixels of color, optically blend in the eye. Let me see if I can find a specific area of this painting where you get that effect. I'm going to use this little streak of like a lighter purple that's going over her leg here. So we can actually see some of the leg color peeking through. This does help to create a feeling of transparency in the painting itself. That being said, there isn't really one correct technique for achieving a sense of transparency. You can do this so many different ways. You could use glazes, you could use this dry brush or scumbling approach, but you could also do it with a very wet into wet technique that doesn't include any dry brush. You could also create the sense of transparency in sculpture where there isn't even any color. Think about those paintings of women wearing veils where you can tell that that veil is this really fine, transparent material. So much of this sense of transparency has to do with recognizing what's actually creating the sense of transparency in our reference. And what that came down to in this particular painting was me just really being mindful of the individual colors of this skirt and honoring all of that. So you'll notice that so much of these brush marks in the skirt area, you really don't see any white brush strokes. I do see some kind of minty green brush strokes that do have some titanium white in the mixture, but it's nothing like what we have up here. And I think that's what people would be really tempted to try and insert to give that sense of transparency. Instead, when I actually looked at these areas of the reference, and I will zoom in here so that you can get that similar sense of what this looks like in action, I was really just looking for the big average shapes of color. And even if I painted those big average shapes of color in the skirt very opaquely, as you see me do in some of these passages, when you zoom out, the effect should still be there. Next up, Karen asks, I would definitely like to know how you managed to keep things loose yet detailed. Did you have your model sit for you, or did you work from a photo? Either way, how did you maintain the look of a classic/old master portraiture style? This painting looks like it could have been done in the 1800s. Also, besides studying psychology, what is your alla prima in painting training? Great questions, Karen. I'm happy to answer these for you. Also, thank you so much for the kind words on this. I really couldn't ask for a greater compliment. Okay, so as far as painting loose yet detailed, so much of this is going to feel like a very similar answer to this question about the transparency in the skirt. It's really important, and I think one really underrated skill when it comes to mastering portraiture comes down to understanding how the eye works. How is it that we can look at this image in front of us and interpret it as a little girl sitting in a chair playing with her dress? When you practice this over and over, you start to develop a little bit of a shorthand. For instance, I really didn't need to paint in the detail of her mouth or her nose or her eye. So long as I had the overall proportion of the head correct, so long as the value seemed to be working, so long as the colors were working, I really didn't have to get too tight with it. The reason that I did is that my hope was for this painting to be in an exhibition, and I knew people would walk up to it, and I wanted to make sure that I gave them payoff for walking up close to the painting. I wanted them to be able to see a little bit more of that information. But you'll notice that as this painting unfolds, I'm really not fussing about these areas until the very end, where I really want these details to be right. I'm really trying my best to hold off on things like the individual fingers or toes. I'm holding off on the wood carving in the chair. I got to the point where I realized that I really wouldn't be served by describing a lot of the specific upholstery in the chair. I thought it would start to make it look overwrought, because just keeping things loose, I realized that it was working. The way that you can actually know this for yourself in your own paintings, this really comes down to a mental flowchart. I was actually just talking with my students earlier today about this flowchart. So as a painting is unfolding, one of my secrets to keeping the looseness is I really want to only focus on areas that are actively causing a problem. if something is working well enough, I typically will be able to get away with leaving it much looser if I don't touch it, if I don't try to fix what ain't broke. So let's use the background of this painting as an example. Specifically, let's use the chair. As I was like midway through this painting, I would take a step back from the piece, I would take off my glasses, I would squint at it, and ideally I would squint at it just side by side with my reference. And I was using a photograph here as I outlined in a previous question. I knew you've already know that, but just to get that part of your question out of the way. I could have probably done this from life, but with a kid, it would be tricky. And even when I got this shot of her, I actually tried to get her back into this pose to get some more reference, and I found that it was really hard. It didn't matter how much kind of guidance or direction I gave her. It felt kind of stiff because I was like directing her in a very stiff, mechanical, like one body part at a time kind of way. So yes, working from life is fantastic when you are working with a model who can come back to the kind of pose you want really reliably, sort of on demand. But especially for children, you know, they aren't art models by default. I find that it's just often easier on everybody to get a good reference photo. So I back up. I'm looking at my painting side by side with the reference, and I'm squinting at both. For me, with my glasses off, because my prescription isn't super strong, I can kind of take my glasses off and squint just a little bit, and I will take in the big picture of this piece. And when I do that, what I'm looking for is the first thing that feels like a distraction on my painting. Now, that would have been a different thing at any given moment in the painting. But interestingly, what came up over and over wasn't the details of the chair or even necessarily the details of the face. They were big picture issues like, oh, the value of the skirt here is wrong, or I really have too much contrast in this arm that is in shadow, or I'm not quite getting the right gesture of the way that she's holding that hand. Those were the kinds of things that I felt were actually really holding me back. And again, I really wanted to be able to solve those problems with shapes that were as simple as possible. And I really resisted the urge to go in and start painting detail. There's a couple of reasons for this. One, as soon as I would succumb to that temptation to paint all the detail, what would inevitably happen would be that I would start tightening up. But the other benefit to just keeping it simple when I'm working out these problems is that inevitably, if my solution wasn't perfect and I had to change it again, I wouldn't have to go and redo a lot of painstaking, tiny brushwork. So for instance, if I had to move this hand where I have gone and I've individually painted these knuckles and fingers, well, I don't want to have to repaint this 7 different times. I would rather give like a very simple indication for the gesture of the arm and the hand overall, make sure that that's correct. And what will inevitably happen is if I go through the painting and I look for the biggest areas that are most distracting and I just fix those in a very big, simple way, over time, I will start to notice that smaller and smaller shapes are distracting. And I can essentially just follow that until I am not distracted by anything anymore. And that's typically how I know that I'm finished. Now, as far as how I maintained the look of this like 1800s portrait style, this I really have to chalk up to having that inspiration board. And I specifically used an inspiration board for this composition. I'll go ahead and give you a quick glimpse of what that looked like. Again, I do outline this in my planning video for this particular piece. So definitely check that out if you want a clear start to finish sense of what this looked like in action, so that I could actually get that effect. But after looking at so many Sargent paintings or paintings from artists who do really successfully capture that kind of 1800s style, I started to notice the things that really stood out over and over, not just in the brushwork, but actually more often it was in the composition. I noticed that she would have to be dressed a certain way for the painting to have this feeling. if she were in totally modern clothing, it would still probably look pretty modern no matter what else I did in the painting. So the choice of costuming was one of the first things that was really important. Similarly, the choice for her hair was significant. Same thing with the choice of furniture. All it takes is one indication of modernity for this kind of impression of a classical vibe to be obliterated in a painting. But beyond that, I think that the light source was a really big deal here. This was something that I noticed when I analyzed my inspiration board that I was using specifically for this painting. These pieces, they didn't have a lot of like indoor fluorescent overhead style lighting. Most of them looked like they were lit from a window. And so when I took lighting in for this portrait, I had a softbox, and that softbox was meant to simulate north window light. And that got this reference photo as close as I reasonably could have gotten to capture that feeling. I think it's really important for me to emphasize that the fact that this photo looks like one of those 1800s paintings, or it looks like it could have been the reference for a Sargent painting where he working from a photograph, that's really what set me up for success. It is much less about magic that happened between my brush and the canvas and much more about the actual planning steps that I took. What's great about that is that I know that all of you can plan a really great painting. This is something that I say to my students over and over again. Most of you are making your jobs so much harder than they need to be. And what that means is that when you have a frustrating painting where it just doesn't have that classical look that you want, it's actually not about your painting skill. Your painting skill isn't holding you back the way that you believe it is. Rather, it's just that you're not putting quite enough intention into the planning, but planning isn't something that involves a ton of skill, at least not compared to actually putting the paint on the canvas. So if us talking through exactly what steps it would make sense for you to take to get this kind of reference, it is worth it for us to actually take that time, because you're going to be so much more set up for success in your own work. So I hope you take this encouragement, Karen, just as a sign that you absolutely can make this happen for yourself, because so much just has to do with the intention. But if any of you are watching this video and you do want help knowing exactly what those planning steps would look like, or you want help actually working out the technique that you would use to translate this onto canvas, I'm here to help, and I would highly encourage you to sign up for Monday's webinar so that you and I can talk about it live. And to wrap up this video, I'm going to go through a few questions from Jackie. Now, Jackie has asked some questions that I think kind of sum up a lot of the questions that others had. So I think this will be a perfect way to kind of bookend this video. Jackie says, well, where do I start? 1, how did you achieve the delicate skin of the little girl and the shadows in her skin tone? Again, I'm actually going to combine this with her third question, which is, how did you achieve the see-through effect of her dress and the lace that she is holding? So much of this has to do with me actually taking a really careful look at my reference and asking myself, exactly what is this big average color? Whether it's a shadow shape under the kind of gauze of the dress, whether it's a shadow shape on her skin tone, I actually just tried to really see what these colors were. I'm going to show you what this looks like specifically in Photoshop, because I think that'll be useful. So here I have Photoshop open and I have my eyedropper tool. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in. And one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and get like an average sample from an area rather than like an individual pixel, because those individual pixels can definitely throw off the results, especially when I'm looking at a gauzy material like this. So what we can see when I actually click on my eyedropper here is that the color of this shadow shape that's under the transparent part of her skirt, to me, I see this color and I immediately think this is going to be transparent oxide brown plus a little bit of ultramarine plus titanium white. It's essentially like a chalky purple brown. I I might have to add a little bit of a truer red like that ruby red or permanent rose color, but I would probably mix up just those 3 pigments first, and I would see what this paint mixture looked like before I started tinkering any further. One thing I'm actually really curious to see is whether or not there are colors like this already on my palette. And what's really interesting, so I'm going to show you this one more time. So the way this eyedropper tool works is that the semicircle on top of this little bullseye that it creates is the current color that you've selected. The semicircle below is the color you had just selected beforehand. So if I go back and I find this shadow area, and then I compare that to what I have on my palette here, you can see these colors are very close. Now, the color that I had eyedropped in the photo reference is a little bit darker, but this tells me that I probably did at some point have a darker color underneath this that I probably just worked a little bit more titanium white into. But if I were actively painting on this right now and I wanted to make sure I had mixed up the correct color, and I started by mixing into this pile, what this tells me is that I would just need to darken it up a little bit. And I think that this would probably just involve getting a little bit of transparent oxide brown, and it would probably take me to the darker color that I got from my photo reference. Similarly, let's take a look at maybe the shadow under her sleeve here. This is an interesting color. It is definitely like very fair and very beige, but to me it reads a little bit bluer than the other areas on her arm. So right away, as I go back over onto my palette, I'm going to look at one of these light flesh tone colors that I mixed up. And interestingly, I see that these colors almost work right into one another. What I have on my palette is maybe just a touch more chromatic, but then once I go into this slightly grayer version off to the left, I actually do have a match. And so that is how I would actually really, really double check that I was mixing and applying the correct colors. Now, I wouldn't have my eyedropper tool out for every minute of this painting, but I do think that it's great as a little bit of a sanity check if you're feeling stuck on a painting, or you're just intimidated by a particular reference. It can make a really big difference. And for any of you who watch someone like Mark Carter's channel and you see how he uses a color checker, that is essentially the exact same tool, but you would use it from life. I'm not using it for this particular painting, or I'm not using something like a color checker for this painting, because I am working off of a screen. That screen emits light, and it would put whatever is on your brush or your color checker or whatever tool you are using to actually hold up your paint mixture, it would put it into shadow. For instance, I'm holding up, this is a rosemary ivory long filbert. These bristles are pretty much white. Technically, they're off-white, but for the sake of this conversation, we will say that they are white. If I hold it up between me and my screen right now, it might look white to you because the screen itself, because I am actually recording this in front of my computer, the screen itself is projecting bright white onto this. But I don't have any light source behind me, so when I look at the tip of this brush juxtaposed with the brightness of my screen, honestly, this is really close to black. Like, the value is very dark because it is in so much shadow. It's really difficult to combine a physical color that you've mixed up and check it off of a digital resource. I much prefer just to use the eyedropper tool on the reference itself and then figure out if I can just visually replicate that on my palette, as you saw me do over here. Jackie also says the hair is lovely, just like the hair of a real young girl, like my daughter at that age, with separated strands that lie on her shoulders. So this was actually something that we were very intentional about in the planning of this piece. She had her hair curled before this. And also, while I was working on this particular piece, I chose to exaggerate some of these curls. So you'll notice that I actually have her hair kind of like sinking more into the slope of her shoulder more. That's because I really wanted to exaggerate some of that curl. I also simplified a few of like the wispier strands of hair just so that I could get, I think, like a pattern of that hair curl that would read more directly and with less visual noise. That being said, I know that this probably just scratches the surface of the kinds of questions that you might have about mastering loose portraiture. So please make sure that you join me for this coming Monday's live masterclass, where I will be answering more of your expressive portraiture FAQs, really exploring that balance between looseness and realism. There's a link in the description below to register and save your spot. You'll also get a replay link to the recording after the webinar is completed. But if you do want to ask me questions live and have that like real-time interaction with me, make sure that you go ahead and mark your calendar so that you can be there with me in real time. I can't wait to see you there. And until then, happy painting.